The names Roosevelt, Astor, Forbes, Yale, and Harvard are familiar to many, yet few realize that all of these illustrious families and institutions gained their wealth through the same dark enterprise, flooding China with opium. Over decades, they imported thousands of tons of the drug, leaving millions addicted and causing countless deaths, all while enjoying profits that soared to 400%. For nearly 2 centuries, they obscured this truth, rewriting history and hiding the blood-stained origins of their fortunes. Now, however, evidence once concealed is coming to light. Shipping records, personal letters, and archival account books reveal that America's elite built their empires on drugs. Exactly the same activities that today land individuals in prison. They fueled China's opioid crisis, destroyed its economy, and became immensely wealthy. So much so that they could erase their roles from history and remain unchallenged. These families, some of the most powerful in the nation, not only financed and built prestigious universities, museums, and political dynasties, but did so with blood money procured through illegal drug smuggling on an industrial scale, with profits reaching 400%. This story, the truth about their criminal origins, has been deliberately buried. The evidence, the shipping logs, correspondence, and financial records, demonstrates that American aristocracies, including the family of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, amassed their fortunes by participating directly in opium trafficking. Roosevelt's grandfather, Warren Delano II, made millions smuggling opium into China, igniting addiction, fueling death, and enriching his family, just as other prominent dynasties did. The Astors, the Forbes, the Perkins, the Russells, and the Cabots all engaged in opium trade, and their wealth funded institutions that continue to influence America today. By the 1830s, American companies controlled 10% of the opium flow into China, trading vast quantities, tons of the drug worth hundreds of millions of dollars, destroying generations of Chinese lives. Despite the devastation, these families accumulated so much wealth that they founded universities, funded museums, and established political dynasties. Their involvement was not passive. They dominated the trade, profiting immensely from an enterprise that devastated an entire nation. Yet, this history has been carefully sanitized, buried beneath layers of sanitized narratives that omit their criminal origins. The truth is undeniable. Ships, letters, and financial ledgers confirm that for nearly 200 years, American elite families profited from the illicit opium trade into China. Their wealth and influence stem from this blood-stained past, and their efforts to conceal it have been thorough. This is the legacy of the families who are still part of America's ruling class. Families like Roosevelt, Astor, Forbes, and others, whose fortunes and institutions remain intertwined with the blood money of drug trafficking, a story that has been deliberately kept from public view, yet can no longer be ignored. This is the hidden story that no one tells. America's elite families built their immense wealth through the opium trade, and yet they later erased that history to protect their reputation. The same families that profited from selling drugs in China spent the next century criminalizing drugs for everyone else. The scale of this hypocrisy is staggering, and the evidence is irrefutable. But before examining individual families, it's crucial to understand what the opium trade truly was. Far from any sanitized museum version, the harsh reality of that era. In the early 19th century, Britain faced a serious dilemma. They were purchasing vast quantities of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, yet China had no interest in the goods Britain was exporting. To pay for these imports, Britain drained its silver reserves, creating a significant economic problem. What could they sell to China in return that Chinese consumers would buy in enormous amounts? The answer was opium. Grown in British-controlled India, processed into a smokable form, and smuggled into China illegally, despite the Chinese government's outright ban on opium, recognizing it as poison. British and American traders showed no concern for Chinese laws. The profits from the opium trade soared. Margin estimates ranged from 400 to 500%. It was possible to buy opium in India for around $100, smuggle it into China, and sell it for $500 or $600. The risks were high. Chinese authorities often executed smugglers caught in the act. Yet the allure of vast profits drew many American families into the fold because American ships were faster than British vessels. Clipper ships, built specifically for speed, were perfect for outrunning Chinese patrols and transporting opium to secret coastal locations. American ship captains would sail to India, load thousands of pounds of opium, and navigate toward Chinese shores, where they would anchor offshore at designated points. Small Chinese boats would approach, row out to the ships, take on the opium, and pay in silver, without the ships ever formally entering Chinese ports. This plausible deniability allowed the smuggling to continue largely unimpeded. The silver paid in China would flow right back to America in immense quantities. For decades, from the early 1800s into the 1840s before the Opium Wars, and even afterward, this illicit trade persisted. Meanwhile, millions of Chinese became addicted, their economy devastated, as silver drained out of China. The wealth generated by these operations helped American families forge legitimate empires. To understand who they were, let's begin with perhaps the most well-known, the Delano family, ancestors of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Warren Delano II, born in 1809 in Massachusetts, was just 19 when he traveled to China to work for a trading company. By the time he turned 24, he had become a partner in Russell and Company, the largest American firm involved in the opium trade in China. This wasn't mere participation. Russell and Company was the dominant force in American involvement in the illicit market. They maintained offices in Canton and Guangzhou, owned clipper ships designed for rapid transportation, and had direct connections with British Indian opium growers. Warren Delano led the firm's operations from 1833 to 1846, overseeing 13 years of large-scale opium smuggling. When he returned to America, he was extraordinarily wealthy, so much so that he could construct a grand 40-room mansion in Newburgh, New York. His wealth afforded his children the finest education and lifestyle, setting the stage for generations to come. This fortune, accumulated through black market dealings, became the foundation of a family legacy that would eventually produce a U.S. president. He was wealthy enough that, after losing money in the Panic of 1857, he could return to China, re-establish his opium trade, and emerge even wealthier. His daughter, Sarah Delano, married James Roosevelt, and their son was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR grew up immersed in privilege, private tutors, Harvard education, and influential political connections, all financed by opium money. Strikingly, in 1935, while serving as president, Roosevelt signed into law the first federal legislation strictly regulating drugs, the precursor to the Marijuana Tax Act and an expansion of narcotic controls. The same man whose family wealth originated from selling drugs to Chinese populations then spent his presidency criminalizing drugs among Americans. The irony is unmistakable and profound. Turning to the Astor family, John Jacob Astor was once the wealthiest man in America. His fortune helped build renowned landmarks like the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and funded various libraries, establishing a formidable dynasty. Yet, his wealth wasn't only from trading furs, despite the popular story. In reality, the cornerstone of his prosperity was the opium trade. Beginning in 1800, Astor's ships, such as the Macedonian, regularly loaded up with opium for China. Instead of merely exchanging furs for Chinese goods, he traded Turkish-grown opium for Chinese silver, which he then used to purchase furs, tea, and silk. This lucrative opium trafficking was the critical leg, an industrial-scale operation, that powered all his other endeavors. By 1840, Astor's fortune was estimated at $20 million, roughly $500 million today, and most of that wealth was derived from illicit opium sales. His great-grandson, John Jacob Astor IV, died aboard the Titanic as one of the richest men in the world, his wealth rooted in the opium trade. The Astor family's name appears on libraries, museums, and university buildings, all funded by Chinese drug profits. The Forbes family, too, has its origins intertwined with opium. Malcolm Forbes, the notable magazine publisher billionaire, inherited a fortune that began in China. In the early 1800s, Boston-based Forbes family ships carried out massive opium shipments to China. Major traders like Robert Bennett Forbes and John Murray Forbes, who also worked with Russell and Company, the same firm Warren Delano served, made their fortune with the drug trade. Robert Forbes operated clipper ships transporting opium, while John Murray invested the profits into railroads, propelling him to immense wealth in Boston. Their descendants leveraged that wealth to create Forbes magazine and entered the ranks of American aristocracy. Despite statues and buildings bearing the family's name in Boston, the connection to opium has been deliberately erased from public history. The Perkins family, led by Thomas Handaside Perkins, commonly known as T.H. Perkins, was among New England's wealthiest in the 1800s. His wealth was built on the opium trade. As a founding partner of Perkins and Company, which later merged with Russell and Company, Perkins managed the smuggling of opium from Turkey and India into China for decades, amassing a fortune of millions. Afterward, he retired to Boston, where he became a respected philanthropist, funding hospitals, asylums, and schools. Yale University's Perkins Fellowship, named in his honor, was financed by opium money. In each of these cases, the wealth acquired through illicit drug trafficking was later institutionalized, funding cities, universities, and philanthropic endeavors, while the dark origins of that wealth have been carefully scrubbed from history. The Perkins School for the Blind in Boston is often remembered for its noble mission and contributions to education, yet beneath that reputation lies a darker history connected to opium money. Thomas Perkins, celebrated as a great philanthropist, has his legacy quietly intertwined with this secret, a footnote easily overlooked. The connection becomes clearer when we consider the Russell family, founders of the prominent firm Russell and Company in 1823. This enterprise quickly rose to dominate the American opium trade in China, amassing enormous wealth in the process. Samuel Russell, after retiring to Connecticut, used some of that fortune to fund the Russell Trust, the organization that still supports Yale University's secret society, Skull and Bones. This elite society, which has produced presidents, Supreme Court justices, and CIA directors, including George H. W. Bush, George W. Bush, and John Kerry, owes part of its origins to opium money. The Russell's family fortune, crucial in establishing this powerful network, came directly from illicit Chinese opium. The profits from such trade not only enriched the Russell family, but also helped finance the society's influence that persists to this day. Their wealth, rooted in drug trafficking, built the foundation for one of America's most secretive and influential organizations. The story continues with the Cabot family, revered as Boston Brahmins, respected and well-established in society. Their wealth also traces back to early 19th century trade with China, and once again, the core commodity was opium. The Cabot's name appears extensively throughout Boston, on Harvard's Cabot House, on streets bearing their name. Yet the connection to opium remains deliberately unmentioned. Similarly, the Lowe family, notably A. B. Labatt Lowe, built their fortune through shipping clipper ships loaded with opium to China, making millions in the process. His son, Seth Lowe, became president of Columbia University, and the family donated money to erect the Lowe Memorial Library. Ironically, the opium money that helped fund this esteemed library is rarely acknowledged in the university's history. This pattern persisted among countless American families in the early 1800s. Many either entered the opium trade directly or worked for firms involved in smuggling. They amassed vast fortunes, selling millions of pounds of opium year after year, and then turned their wealth towards building railroads, real estate, universities, museums, and hospitals. Over time, these once dubious origins were carefully erased from family histories, replaced with stories of legitimate enterprise and philanthropy. Their descendants rose to the upper echelons of American society, becoming aristocrats with a centuries-old secret, one that no one openly discusses. By the 1830s, American firms controlled approximately 10% of the opium entering China. Although British companies predominated, American traders played a significant role, with Russell and Company alone shipping thousands of chests each year, each containing roughly 140 pounds of opium. This was industrial-scale smuggling, driven by tremendous profits. A successful voyage could yield 400 to 500% profit, making ship captains and trade owners instant millionaires. Decades of such operations continued even after China fought the First and Second Opium Wars, conflicts initiated to curb the illicit trade. Despite China's efforts to suppress opium, American firms swiftly adapted, refining their techniques to conceal their activities better. The destructive toll of this addiction was staggering. By the 1830s, some 10 to 12 million Chinese, about 10% of the adult male population, were addicted to opium. This widespread dependency crippled China's economy, drained its silver reserves, and devastated its society. Yet, behind this human catastrophe stood powerful American families whose fortunes fueled their ascent into the nation's elite. The flow of silver out of China to settle debts for opium was immense, draining China's reserves and fueling addiction across the nation. In response, Chinese authorities appointed Commissioner Lin Zexu to suppress the illicit trade, and in 1839, he confiscated and destroyed around 1,000 tons of British opium in Canton. Britain's reaction was swift and aggressive. War. The First Opium War, fought from 1839 to 1842, culminated in Britain's victory and the forced signing of the Treaty of Nanking. This treaty compelled China to pay reparations, opened several ports to British trade, and ceded Hong Kong, yet it didn't explicitly legalize opium, making enforcement nearly impossible. As a result, the opium trade actually expanded in the subsequent years. During the conflict, American firms such as Russell and Company seized the opportunity, taking over operations that British firms could no longer conduct during hostilities. After the war ended, both British and American smugglers resumed their activities at intensified levels. This pattern repeated during the Second Opium War between 1856 and 1860, when China again attempted to suppress the trade. Britain and France declared war to force China to legalize opium and to open more ports, with American companies continuing to profit throughout and in the aftermath of the conflict. The human toll in China was devastating. Millions fell into addiction, countless families were destroyed, and the Chinese economy was ravaged. Meanwhile, in American cities like Boston, New York, and Hartford, wealthy families amassed enormous fortunes, built opulent mansions, and funded prestigious universities, all with the profits from the drug trade. It is perhaps the most enraging aspect that these same families, who amassed wealth through the sale of opium, later led efforts to criminalize drugs in America. In the early 20th century, the United States spearheaded international initiatives such as the Hague Opium Convention of 1912 and the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914, establishing global drug prohibition. The reason for this shift was clear. By that time, those elite families had already profited immensely, and the increasing presence of Chinese immigrants in American cities, opening opium dens, threatened their dominance. They sought to prevent American workers from falling into addiction, just as Chinese laborers had, and moreover, they aimed to hide the origins of their wealth. To achieve this, they demonized opium users, depicting them as criminals and degenerates, and erased from history the fact that their own families had once mastered the mass marketing of the drug to China. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose grandfather Warren Delano II had made millions smuggling opium, signed some of the strictest drug laws in American history. Throughout the 20th century, these same families spent decades prosecuting and imprisoned countless individuals for drug-related offenses, yet their own role in fostering the drug trade was carefully buried. This history has been systematically whitewashed. Few Americans are aware that the Delano, Astor, Forbes, Perkins, Russell, and Cabot families built their fortunes on opium. The Delano family's connection is barely acknowledged at the FDR Presidential Library, downplayed as simple trade with China. The Astor family's history makes scant mention of opium, focusing instead on furs and real estate. The Forbes family's narratives highlight railroads and magazines, completely omitting their origins in opium smuggling. Even Yale University's records refer only to Samuel Russell as a benefactor, without mention of the significant role drug money played in funding his success. Harvard's Cabot House, named after the influential Cabot family, hides its true origins, its deep involvement in opium trading, from the official history. The systematic and calculated nature of this erasure is evident. Over the years, these families have used their wealth and power to rewrite the narrative, ensuring their sordid past remains concealed. They donated large sums to universities, attaching strings that mandated the omission of certain facts, effectively controlling the story told about their history through foundations and endowments. By doing so, they shaped public perception and guarded their legacy, making certain that generations of their descendants would grow up unaware of the true source of their fortunes. Despite this effort at concealment, the evidence is irrefutable. Archival records, including shipping manifests, personal letters, and financial account books, stored across archives in China, Britain, and America, document these dark histories. Scholars and researchers have examined these materials and authored numerous books. The Delano Influence by Daniel W. Delano, When America First Met China by Eric J. Dolan, The Opium Clippers by Basil Lubbock, and Yankee Traders, Old Coasters, and African Middlemen by George Brooks, Jr., all shed light on the clandestine operations. Yet, this crucial history remains largely absent from school curricula and public museums, leaving most Americans unaware. The families involved prefer this silence, knowing that if the truth were revealed, it could shatter their well-crafted images and provoke uncomfortable questions. For example, if the Delano family amassed wealth through drug trafficking that led to millions of Chinese lives being ruined or lost, how can Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose family's wealth originated from such sources, be celebrated as a national hero? Similarly, if the Forbes family's fortune stemmed from poisoning China, why do we still admire Malcolm Forbes? And if Yale's Skull and Bones Society was secretly funded by opium profits, what does that imply about the integrity of America's elite institutions? Recognizing these connections would create a cognitive dissonance too difficult to ignore. This concealment mirrors modern scandals, like the 1980s and 1990s revelations of the CIA allowing cocaine to flood American inner cities, funding rebels in Nicaragua, and devastating black communities through the crack epidemic. When those stories emerged, public outrage, investigations, and admissions followed. Yet, the truth about these families' past, the deliberate flooding of China with opium for profit, remains hidden with no public reckoning. The same families, now wealthy and influential, have managed to rewrite history, erasing their crimes and securing their riches and status across generations. Estimates suggest that American firms reaped between $50 and $100 million from the China opium trade between the years of 1890 and 1860. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $1.5 to $3 billion in today's money, and this figure accounts only for the profits. The total volume of opium moved was many times greater, highlighting that this was not petty smuggling but a vast, industrial-scale trafficking enterprise. This was organized, large-scale drug trafficking, ships sailing full of illegal commodities, warehouses storing illegal substances, messengers, bribes, and an entire logistical network. The American companies involved employed thousands: Chinese middlemen, ship crews, traders in Canton, and investors in Boston. It was a vast, coordinated criminal enterprise. Yet in America, it was never seen as criminal, but as legitimate business. The men steering these operations were celebrated as successful entrepreneurs and industry leaders. To grasp the enormity of this scale, consider a hypothetical scenario today. Imagine a handful of wealthy American billionaires operating a cartel that floods Mexico with fentanyl, leading to millions of addicts and hundreds of thousands of deaths. These same billionaires would then use their profits to endow Harvard, fund political campaigns, and support cultural institutions like museums. Decades later, their descendants would sit in the halls of power, presidents, senators, university chancellors, while the original source of their wealth remained a secret. This is precisely what happened with the so-called opium families, except that today we're living in the world they built, in the legacies they left behind. Yet, discussing this openly remains taboo. The Chinese remember. In China, the opium wars are integral to national identity. They call it the century of humiliation, when Western powers forcibly pushed opium onto China and carved up the country for profit. It's a lesson woven into their education, a testimony to the destruction wrought by imperial greed. In stark contrast, most Americans remain unaware. The history of the opium wars is rarely taught here. Few know that American families profited immensely from selling opium into China, or that their descendants continue to wield enormous wealth and influence. The sharp difference in collective memory is glaring. China remembers and teaches the truth of what was done to them, while America prefers to forget and whitewash its past. The families who profited from this illicit trade are all too happy to keep that truth hidden. So, what should we do with this knowledge? First, we must confront the truth openly. The Delano, Astor, Forbes, Perkins, Russell, Cabot, and Low families built their fortunes through opium sales to China. Millions of Chinese became addicted, with tragic consequences for their health and economy. Meanwhile, these American families accumulated enough wealth to establish dynasties and influence for generations. Second, we need to acknowledge the deep hypocrisy involved. The same families that amassed wealth through drug trafficking later led efforts to criminalize and enforce drug prohibition worldwide, hiding their own histories of trafficking and addiction. Their wealth funded policies that criminalized the very substances they once profited from, an extraordinary act of double standard and self-interest. Third, we must scrutinize the institutions that were financed with illicit money: the Ivy League universities, museums, hospitals, and foundations. Many of their buildings and programs were funded, at least in part, by the proceeds of drug trafficking. Should these institutions acknowledge this legacy? Should reparations be considered? Should those families still benefiting from this wealth be held accountable? These are uncomfortable questions, but overdue. Today, these families, the Delanos, Forbes, Russells, Cabots, remain influential within America's elite. Their fortunes, built on clandestine dealings with opium, continue to shape the country's social and political landscape. Their wealth and power are rooted in a past that's deliberately obscured, a history they carefully suppress to protect their reputation. The evidence for this history is undeniable: shipping records, correspondence, archive documents, carefully documented by researchers and historians. Yet, it remains hidden from public knowledge, buried beneath layers of whitewashed narratives and institutional silence. This concealment serves the interests of those who wish to maintain their dominance, ensuring that historians and the public remain unaware of the dark origins of many American fortunes. Recognizing this truth requires us to confront our history honestly. It challenges the narratives of progress and success that have long been celebrated. It forces us to question: if powerful families profited from such grave crimes, how can we still revere them? How have these legacies shaped our institutions, our policies, and our societal values? Understanding this history is uncomfortable but vital. It reveals that America's wealthy elite, in part, owe their status to illicit, destructive trade, and that these profits helped build the very institutions that define American power today. Uncovering this truth doesn't diminish achievements, but adds necessary context. It's a call to acknowledge the past fully and to ensure that such injustices are not erased or ignored. Because, ultimately, the stories of these opium families, their crimes, and their influence demand recognition. They remind us that the foundations of many American institutions were built on blood money, a reality that cannot be hidden forever. Only by facing it can we truly understand our history and begin to address its lingering consequences. They have never been held accountable for it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's family amassed their wealth through the sale of drugs to China. The Astors built their empire on opium trading. Even Forbes magazine derives its origins from opium profits, and the legendary Skull and Bones Society was financed with drug money. Universities such as Harvard, Yale, and Columbia have buildings financed by these illicit gains. This is not a conspiracy theory, it is well-documented history. Archival records, correspondence, shipping manifests, and financial ledgers all provide evidence that researchers have thoroughly examined. Numerous books have explored this dark chapter, yet the average American remains largely unaware because the story has been thoroughly sanitized, whitewashed, and erased from official history. The families that profited from these crimes prefer the truth remain hidden, because if it were known, it would reveal that some of the most powerful, most esteemed, and most influential families in American history are descended from drug traffickers. The institutions they established, universities, foundations, political dynasties, were funded by poisoning millions of Chinese people. The reality is grim, but it is undeniable. It's time for the truth to be known. If this alters your perception of American history, consider seeking out more information, because countless stories like this, hidden truths, and lies that need exposing still lie beneath the surface. The opium families evaded justice for 2 centuries, But the truth can't stay hidden forever. I will continue uncovering it.